All the characters in the story are over 18 years old. The heat of midsummer was in the city for 7 days in a row. It drove everyone a little crazy. The evening brought some relief, but even with the onset of night, the heat persisted for several hours after sunset. Maddie Ryerson has been tired of the heat for a long time. It was exhausting her more and more every day. She poured herself a glass of chilled white wine and took it into the living room. It was 10 p.m. at the Ryerson house, and the family's favorite TV show was about to begin. Her husband Carl is already comfortably ensconced in his favorite armchair not far from the big screen TV. He had taken his seat to watch TV 2 hours earlier and hadn't moved in all that time, except to grab a beer in the kitchen. He was nursing his fifth can. His working day was long and stressful, and the beer did a lot to soften his short temper. Maddie saw her son Kyle sitting on the couch to the left of Carl's chair and behind him. Kyle, a college sophomore, lived away from his parents during the school year, but he chose to stay in his old room for the summer and worked long hours at a local construction company. Kyle kicked off his shoes and put his feet on the low table in front of the couch. Maddie noticed how much colder it was in the living room. Carl set the thermostat to a low temperature, and the air conditioner pumped cold air into the house, giving everyone a welcome relief from the summer heat. Earlier in the day, mindful of the scorching daytime temperatures, Maddie wore a sleeveless sundress with buttons on the front. Now, at 10 p.m., it was cooler, even a little chilly, and goosebumps appeared on Maddie's legs and arms. Walking around the couch to sit down, Maddie noticed Kyle and Carl in her field of vision. Kyle looked very much like his father, with short blonde hair and a well-defined face with sharp features. However, he was taller than his father, and while his father became soft in middle age, Kyle kept his body in shape and got rid of fat through constant exercise and the daily difficulties of his job. Maddie furrowed her brows at the sight of her husband's figure. She wanted him to take better care of himself. Maddie, unlike Carl, took great care of herself. Despite the fact that she was about 40 years old, Maddie retained the freshly washed look of a neighbor girl from her youth. She looked critically with pale blue eyes at the way her son's legs were lying. "Kyle, get your feet off the table," she said. Kyle took his feet off the table with the slowness and reluctance of a teenager. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. Maddie was about to sit on the other end of the couch when Carl spoke up. "Hey, Maddie," Carl said, his voice a little slurred from the beer. "You might not want to sit here." I spilled beer on the other end of the couch. I tried to wipe it with a wet towel, but it's all wet on the other side. "Oh," Maddie exclaimed. She bent down and sniffed the seat cushion. He didn't smell like beer, so Carl must have managed to wipe it off. But Carl was right. It was very wet. She thought about turning over the seat cushion, but decided it was better to leave it to dry. Maddie prided herself on taking care of everything. She liked it that way. It wasn't easy to keep things like this, having my own job and a husband who seemed to be getting lazier every day. Thank God that her son Kyle, although he looked like a teenager in many of his habits, often volunteered to help with the housework. "Here, Mom," Kyle said, patting the couch to his left. "There is a little space here. I'll move over so you can sit next to me." Kyle pressed his feet as far as possible against the right side of the small sofa. Maddie squeezed in next to Kyle on his side of the couch. She put a pillow on another pillow. A television show called Angel City Detective has begun. The film premiered on the cable channel a year ago and became their favorite. The series was about an attractive, young female detective fighting crime in modern Los Angeles. Her name was Angel, and the irony of her name was that despite her standard police methods, along with her innocent appearance and low-key beauty, she had a dark, wild side that she tried her best to keep secret from her work colleagues. The Ryersons sat down to watch it every week. Maddie looked at Carl again, annoyed. She wanted him to have better control over his drinking. Maddie didn't mind Carl having a couple of drinks to relax when he got home, but lately, his routine involved more than a couple of cans, and by the time he turned off the TV, he was often drunk. Maddie's personal life suffered because of Carl's addiction to alcohol. Lately, it seemed to her that he loved his six-pack more than his wife. Carl's inattention made her feel constantly upset. The relentless heat of the last 7 days has only made the situation worse. When the opening credits of the show began, Maddie suddenly realized that the air conditioner was making her feel uncomfortably cold. "Carl," she said, "it's getting a little chilly." Do you think you could turn off the air conditioner? Gee, baby, Carl said. The temperature is normal for me. I think it's because you're so scantily clad. Carl grabbed a colorful knitted blanket hanging on the back of his chair and, barely taking his eyes off the TV screen, threw it to Maddie and Kyle. Maddie scooped him up and draped him over her legs. Kyle shook his head at his father's rudeness. I'll do it, Mom, he said, getting up to turn off the air conditioner. She made room for him, and half a minute later he returned to the same place on the couch. Would you like a blanket too? What is it? She asked. Kyle wasn't really cold, but the room was chilly, and the idea of sharing a blanket with his mom seemed cozy. Of course, he said. All three of them were sitting watching the performance. The main character, Angel, arrived at her apartment after a hard day's work spent investigating a murder. She poured herself some bourbon on the rocks. Something about Angel seemed familiar to Kyle. You know, Mom, he said. She's kind of like you. Don't you think so, Dad? Carl chuckled, barely catching Kyle's question through the fog of his growing intoxication. Probably the same as your mom was 10 years ago, he said. I don't know. His attention never left the TV screen. Obviously, he didn't want to be interrupted. Kyle leaned into his mother's ear. I don't think Dad pays attention to what he says, he whispered to her so that her father wouldn't hear. He pointed at the TV screen. She does look a bit like you, but I think you look better than she does. Maddie, who was frowning at Carl's rude remark, perked up and smiled at Kyle's kind words. Then the doorbell rang on the TV show. Angel went to answer it, and opening the door, she dragged a man, clearly younger than herself, through the door into her arms. They fell to the floor. One of the things that Kyle and the rest of America liked about the series was that the main character, Angel, looked so healthy and straightforward. But he felt strange, having just compared the woman who was lying on the floor to his mom. Mom also looked healthy and innocent. She had the right way to do everything. But he wondered if his mother had ever lost her temper before pushing the thought away and telling himself that he shouldn't think about such things. Meanwhile, Maddie watched the scene unfolding on the TV screen with a pang of envy. Carl and I used to do this kind of thing, she thought to herself. But that was so long ago. Lately, Carl didn't seem too interested in it, and on the few occasions when he did show interest, drinking weakened his ability to maintain a relationship. The man with Angel was a young blonde man, and he had lean but prominent muscles, like her son Kyle, she thought. With the air conditioner turned off, the room warmed up quickly. The blanket probably wasn't necessary anymore, but Maddie felt comfortable sitting under it next to Kyle, so she didn't take it off. Suddenly, a shot rang off-screen in the series. Maddie jumped in surprise and took her son's hand. For a second, Maddie thought that maybe there had been too much contact between her and her son, but doing something about it would mean drawing attention to this fact, and she decided it was better to just leave it as it is. Carl stood up and scratched his stomach. I'm going to get another beer, he muttered. Does anyone want anything? Maddie and Kyle both said no. Maddie looked at her husband with disapproval again. Laziness and beer have taken their toll on his once muscular physique. She was struck by the contrast between her husband and her son. Kyle, for his part, was annoyed with his father, who seemed to have no appreciation for his mother at all. Kyle knew that many years ago they were in love with each other in high school, and Dad was the star of the football team, but that was a long time ago. Looking at his mom and Dad now, he realized that they were completely unsuitable for each other. Dad was getting plump and with rounded cheeks, while his mom still looked fresh, fit, and pretty. She was more beautiful than any of his friends' moms. There was no doubt about that. After his father went to the kitchen for a beer, Kyle looked at his mother out of the corner of his eye. Your dad's not behaving very well, Kyle, Maddie said. I know, Mom, he said. He should be kinder to you. Carl returned to the living room with not one beer, but two. One could be drunk at once, and the other could be left in reserve in case of need. Maddie hoped he wouldn't need another one. He's already had too much to drink. Carl sank into a chair with a heavy sigh. He opened the lid on the beer can and soon immersed himself in his program. Ugh, Maddie said. What's wrong, Mom? Kyle asked. I can't stay on this side of the couch because this pillow is too small, she said. Kyle thought about getting up and offering his seat to his mom. That would be chivalrous, he thought. But then he had another idea. He wasn't sure about it, but there didn't seem to be any harm in suggesting it. How about you climb in with me? He asked his mother. He said it as calmly as he could. Are you sure? Mom asked. Don't you think it would be inconvenient? No, Mom, Kyle said. Well, she said, you're cute. I know that's not true. She paused. I think we can try this. Maddie and Kyle tried to focus on the TV show, but each of them found it difficult. You shouldn't have thought that about your mom, he thought, but he couldn't help himself. Maddie couldn't help but jump up again during the scary scene. Maddie wasn't sure what she was doing. Kyle didn't know what to think either. It would seem that he did nothing that could have occurred to him to make this happen. He tried to control his thoughts. Was his mom, after all, but he couldn't get rid of the pleasant thoughts. She didn't know what to do. She thought she should object, maybe in a whisper, or maybe push Kyle's hands back with her own. But she wasn't sure she could do it, and she thought it would be even worse to draw attention to what was happening. In the end, nothing really happened. It would be awkward to say something. It was important for Maddie to do the right thing, but she wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. Kyle felt hot under the covers. He usually threw off the blanket. Kyle knew he wasn't an expert at reading women's minds, but it was especially difficult for him to figure out what Mom was thinking. As far as he could tell, she didn't do anything to cheer him up, but she didn't stop him either. The show continued. Dad seemed barely awake. He hadn't looked back or said anything to Maddie or Kyle in the last 10 minutes. Maddie suddenly realized that she was excited. Her whole body was tense and alive. It was wrong, wasn't it? And yet they didn't actually do anything inappropriate. But it wasn't like that. Something was happening. She wondered if he liked it, what he was feeling, what he was thinking. She thought she was a good judge of men, but it was hard for her to understand what Kyle was thinking and feeling. What if she sends him a signal? Very small. Something barely noticeable. What would he do? How would he react? She thought about it. She and Kyle looked into each other's eyes. They didn't say a word, but there was an understanding between them. Kyle looked back at his father's chair. No movement from Dad. She smiled back at her son, her loving, strong, and growing bigger son. Maddie couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. She looked at the back of Carl's chair to make sure he wasn't looking. She couldn't let it get out of hand. After all, it was her son, and her husband was by the side of both of them. She turned back to the TV screen and tried to watch the show. However, Kyle was no longer up to watching TV. Mom liked it, Kyle thought, and she wouldn't want to make a scene in front of Dad. I shouldn't have done that, she thought. If she just sat quietly and watched TV, she could enjoy what was happening and at the same time pretend that nothing was happening. However, she couldn't afford it in front of her husband. Even in his current state, he would have noticed it. She couldn't let him do that. It was too risky. If the husband had accidentally looked back, Carl's attention wasn't distracted from the show, so they assumed he hadn't heard it. But she still had to be careful and not let Carl know what was going on. Suddenly, Carl spoke. His voice startled them both. I think I fell asleep for a minute, he said. Do you guys like the show? Carl bent down and turned to them. Maddie and Kyle froze under the covers. Neither of them moved. Maddie looked at her husband and said nothing. Fortunately, Maddie and Kyle saw that after 7 beers, Carl had trouble focusing his eyes. Besides, he looked tired. His gaze swept over his son and wife without any hint that he understood what was going on. I need to go to the bathroom, he announced and stood up again, even more uncertainly than before. He walked out of the living room into the hallway, and Maddie and Kyle froze in place until the bathroom door was locked. When they heard the lock click, Maddie threw off the blanket and turned to her tall son. Then they both heard the toilet flush and the door open down the hall. Carl's heavy footsteps were heard. Dad staggered down the hall back to the living room. He was standing behind the couch, far enough away. Carl looked absently at the TV screen, as if deciding if there was anything there that needed further viewing. The TV show kept going, but none of them had any idea what was going on. Carl pointed vaguely at the TV. Will she ever find out what she was looking for? He asked. Kyle had no idea what his father was talking about, but he decided to play along. Yes, Dad, he said. I think she's aware of the situation. That was all he could think of to say. Yeah, well, Carl said, this angel always gets what she wants. Yes, she does, Kyle said, trying to keep his voice level. Carl looked around the room. Where's your mom? He asked. Oh, Kyle said, I think she went to the laundry to get something. He waved his hand. This seemed to satisfy Carl, who couldn't think clearly. He turned and headed for his bedroom. He swayed slightly as he walked. I'm going to bed, he said. Don't turn off the show because of me. You two just keep doing what you're doing. See you in the morning. We'll do it, Dad, Carl said. When his father's thundering footsteps faded and Kyle heard the door of his parents' bedroom close, he called his mother. Kyle stared at his mom for almost a minute. Sit down, Mom, he said. I can't take this anymore, Mom, Kyle said, and his voice was barely above a hoarse whisper. I think you need to take a shower, Kyle said. I'm not going to take a shower, she said. I'm going to sleep like this. Your father is too drunk to notice it. The air conditioner had been turned off almost an hour ago, and the summer heat had returned to the living room, but Maddie didn't mind. The flickering light from the TV distracted them. Maddie and Kyle, mother and son, turned to the screen at the same time. The show ended and the credits rolled. I love this show, Maddie said. Kyle agreed. He couldn't wait for the next episode. They did what they did when their father was sleeping again.